Nancy Guthrie, Bible teacher, author, and voice for the grieving, has done something most people could never survive, let alone transform into a calling. At 84, she carries a weight that would have broken anyone else. Not once, not twice, but the devastating loss of 2 children, both to the same rare, fatal genetic condition, before either child reached their first year of life. Heartbreaking doesn't begin to cover it. Tragic feels insufficient, because what Nancy Guthrie endured wasn't a single catastrophe. It was a pattern, a return of grief so shocking that even the medical world stood in stunned disbelief. She could have collapsed inward. She could have grown bitter. She could have turned her face away from the God she had built her life around. She didn't. But behind the grace, the eloquence, and the quiet strength that radiates from every page she has ever written, every stage she has ever stood on, lies a story not glamorous, but brutal. If Nancy Guthrie has ever made you feel that sorrow can be survived, that faith is not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger. Hit like as tribute to her courage. This is the story of a woman who buried 2 children, stood in the ruins of her own heart, and chose to become a lighthouse for every parent who would follow her into that darkness. The beginning was not glamorous, but it was shaped by devotion. Nancy Guthrie was born in 1941 in the American Midwest, into a household where faith was not a weekend habit, but the architecture of daily life. The post-warriors in which she grew up were defined by a particular kind of American striving. Families rebuilding, communities rallying, churches full on Sunday mornings with people who had seen enough of the world to need something larger than themselves to hold onto. Nancy grew up in that world, and it formed her. Her early life was marked not by celebration, but by quiet formation. She was not raised in wealth. The family was modest in means, structured by values rather than abundance. What few people know is that the groundwork for everything she would later become, the teacher, the theologian, the grief companion, was laid in those ordinary, uncelebrated years. She pursued education with seriousness. She developed a love of language, of scripture, of the kind of writing that doesn't just inform the mind, but moves the soul. She met and married David Guthrie, and together they built what looked, from the outside, like an enviable life, a solid marriage, a shared faith, a home in Nashville, Tennessee. Their son, Matt, came first, a healthy boy, proof that life could be generous. Then came the years that would test everything. Nancy had never heard of Zellweger syndrome before 1998. Most people hadn't. It is a rare, catastrophic chromosomal disorder, a condition affecting the body's ability to form paroxysms, the cellular structures essential to brain and organ development. Babies born with Zellweger syndrome do not survive long. There is no treatment. There is no cure. There is only time, measured in months, and whatever love a family can pour into those months. Nancy and David had no reason to fear it. No family history pointed toward it. The cruelty of genetics doesn't always announce itself in advance. The first signs came with their daughter, Hope. Then came 1998. And everything Nancy Guthrie thought she knew about her future was quietly, irrevocably redrawn. Her daughter Hope Guthrie was born on October 11, 1998, in Nashville, Tennessee. From the earliest days, something was wrong. Hope was not developing the way a newborn should. The assessments came, the specialist consultations came, and then in the cold, clinical language of a diagnosis came the word that changed everything. Zellweger syndrome. Hope would not live long. The doctors were clear. Nancy and David were given a roadmap not to a future, but through a goodbye. What Nancy did in those months is the foundation of everything she would later build. She didn't retreat. She documented. She prayed. She leaned into her faith with the kind of ferocity that only desperation can produce. And she wrote, not yet for an audience, but for herself, trying to make sense of what no parent should ever have to make sense of. Hope Guthrie died on August 17, 1999. At 199 days old, the grief was total. The silence in the house was the kind that has weight. And then came the conversation with the doctor that would define the next chapter. Nancy and David were told that because Zellweger syndrome is a recessive genetic disorder, any future pregnancy carried a 1 in 4 chance of producing another affected child. The medical community's recommendation was clear: do not have more biological children. Nancy and David made a different choice. They chose to try again. They chose to trust. And they chose, in a decision that is almost incomprehensible in its courage, to accept whatever came. In 2001, their son Gabriel was born, and the diagnosis came again: Zellweger syndrome. Again. Gabriel Guthrie lived for 183 days. He died on September 10, 2001, one day before the world was permanently altered by the attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. The country entered collective grief the morning after Gabriel was buried. Nancy was already in it. It was out of this wilderness, this unimaginable double loss, that her public voice was born. Her first book, Holding On to Hope, was published in 2002 by Tyndale House Publishers. It was not a self-help book. It was not a manual for grief management. It was something rarer and more dangerous, an honest account of what it feels like to lose a child and still believe in a good God. It resonated immediately. It resonated deeply. It found its way into the hands of grieving parents, confused pastors, exhausted chaplains, and ordinary people who had experienced loss and felt abandoned by the easy answers the church sometimes offers. The book became a foundational text in Christian grief literature. It launched a speaking career. It opened doors to conferences, seminars, pulpits, and eventually to theological education settings that rarely welcomed women with her background. By 2006, Nancy had co-founded respite retreats alongside David, weekend gatherings in Nashville for couples who had lost children, offering not programs, but presence, community, space to grieve without performance. By 2010, she had produced a multi-volume Bible study series, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament, that would be used in churches, seminaries, and small groups across the United States and internationally. She had become, without ever intending to, one of the most important voices in evangelical Christian theology and grief ministry in the 21st century. To understand Nancy Guthrie, you must sit with the weight of what she actually lived. On October 11, 1998, she became a mother for the second time. Hope arrived with all the promise her name carried. In those first days, Nancy held her daughter and believed in miracles. She prayed for them. She asked God to rewrite the diagnosis. The faith was not passive or resigned. It was furious and alive. But hope declined, and Nancy watched, day by day. She changed diapers and sang songs and read scripture aloud and held that small body against her own. She did the ordinary work of motherhood inside an extraordinary sorrow. She told God everything she was feeling, including the parts that weren't polite. On August 17, 1999, Hope died. She was 6 months and 6 days old. The grief that followed was the kind that rewires a person. Nancy has described it in writing, the disorientation of returning to normal life. When nothing is normal, the strange social awkwardness of loss, the way well-meaning people say the wrong things, and the lonely silence of those who say nothing at all. She has written, the world expects grief to be linear. It is not. It circles back. It ambushes you in grocery stores and ordinary Tuesdays. Then, before she had fully surfaced from the depths, Nancy made the choice that would divide the year 2001 into before and after. Gabriel was born. Gabriel received the same diagnosis, and Nancy knew, this time she knew from the beginning, what the end would look like. There is something almost unbearable about conscious grief, about loving someone fully while knowing the goodbye is already written. Nancy has spoken about this with remarkable precision. It is not easier to grieve when you are prepared. Anticipatory grief does not reduce the loss. It only extends the suffering across more days. Gabriel lived 183 days. He died on September 10, 2001. The next morning, America watched New York City burn. The country entered grief. Nancy was buried inside her own. And yet, in a detail that is almost too poignant to process, she has spoken about how the national mourning of September 11th in some ways allowed her to grieve alongside millions of people. The country was finally in the same room she had been living in for years. It is heartbreaking when private grief meets public catastrophe. It is also, sometimes, quietly connecting. What followed was the season of the book, of holding on to hope, of choosing, deliberately, painfully, faithfully, to transmute private tragedy into public service, the world saw a composed, theologically articulate woman speaking at conferences. But the truth was different. Behind every talk she gave, every chapter she wrote, every couple she sat with at respite retreat, was a mother who had buried 2 children in 3 years, who had held small bodies going still, who had walked back into an empty nursery twice. That is not a platform. That is a wound that became a window. Today, at 84, Nancy Guthrie continues to teach, write, and speak with a clarity that only decades of hard-won wisdom can produce. She and David remain together in Nashville, Tennessee, a marriage that survived what many marriages do not. The loss of a child is one of the leading causes of divorce. They lost 2, and they stayed.